Hello. Hello. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We are delighted to have you here tonight for Peter's book launch, Liberation and Corruption, Why Freedom Movements Fail. We are going to have a packed evening, which starts right now. And please, to start with, allow me to introduce the distinguished panel tonight. We have Lord Peter Hain, who's a British politician who served as an MP for Neath from 1991, a life peer from 2015, and a Privy Councillor from 2001. He was a Labour government minister for 12 years, 7 of these in the cabinet. He helped negotiate the 2000 settlement to end the conflict in Northern Ireland, and was a foreign minister with successive responsibilities for Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. He has chaired the United Nations Security Council and negotiated international treaties, and was also Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Secretary of State for Wealth, Leader of the House of Commons, and Energy Minister. What you probably wouldn't know from this biography is that in 1969 and 1970, Peter led militant British anti-apartheid campaigns to stop all white South African sports tours, and in retaliation was nearly imprisoned for conspiracy, sent a letter bomb, and framed for a bank theft he never knew anything about. I must confess that Peter is the author of 29 books, and as an academic, I'm in awe. And his work spans quite a few genres, from biography, memoir, for thrillers, and his South African memoir, A Pretoria Boy, published in 2021. Please join me in a round of applause for our author tonight, Lord Peter Hain. Our distinguished speaker tonight, respondent to Peter's book, is Patricia Janet Scotland, Baroness Scotland of Astle, who's a Dominican British barrister and politician who served as the 6th Secretary General of the Commonwealth Nations from 2016 to 2025, nearly just yesterday. She was the first woman to hold that position. After working as a barrister in London, she was appointed as a life peer in 1997, and as a British Labour Party politician, served in ministerial positions within the UK government, most notably as Attorney General for England and Wales and as Advocate General for Northern Ireland. She's a dual citizen of the UK and Dominican Republic, where she was born. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Patricia. And before we start the event, please allow me to introduce our director for the School for Government, Professor Michael Sanders, who's going to talk a little bit about our department and the role that Peter has in our department. Michael?
Thanks, Rosanna. Okay, so I will talk very briefly and also very fast. Because those are the only 2 ways I know how to talk. Actually, I can talk at length, but my students don't like it when I do, so I'm not going to do that now. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're hosting this book launch here at King's today. I'm the director of the School for Government, which is a part of the Policy Institute at King's, which is a part of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Public Policy. So now you have a sense of our organogram, which is very important for you all to know. The School for Government is a school which focuses on education and training and research focused on the way that government is rather than the way that we would like government to be, or indeed the way that we fear that it might be. It's about trying to educate current civil servants and people who wish to serve their countries to do that as well as possible, which means we have to be grounded in both academic rigor and a real pragmatism and realism. It is in that capacity that Peter has very kindly been a visiting professor at the school for many years, and brings real depth of expertise and many other wonderful qualities as both a visiting professor and as a human being. And I've been very grateful for his warmth since I joined the school as director a year ago. The mission of the school, and this is one of the hazards of coming up with a list of 3 words that all begin with the same letter, is sometimes I say them in the wrong order and they are written behind me. So you can all jeer, or if you want, go into full pantomime mode if I get this wrong. But the mission of the school is to help create a world that is led with intelligence, integrity, and innovation. Now, I'm not saying anything about Peter's intelligence or his love of innovation when I say that he really embodies the second of those three things that we are trying to do: integrity, as a lifelong a life of standing up for what he believes in and what he believes is right. First, as Roxana says, as a anti-apartheid campaigner who really put his money and his life where his values were, and then as a leading politician of the New Labour era, Peter has stood up for what he believes in throughout his life and really embodies that integrity that we want to see here in the school. In addition, he also is fiercely realistic, as you will read in this book, which I encourage you all to buy, and that sometimes when we hope that the world is going to materialize into a wonderful place and we're going to have some sunlit uplands of any kind you favor, that sometimes we don't get them. I'm not talking about any specific sunlit uplands, but in general. And I think this book is a really important contribution to how we can temper some of our optimism with that realism. So I will now hand back over to Roxana and to our excellent speakers, because you've heard quite enough from me. But thank you everybody for being here, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael. I will now invite Peter and Patricia on the stage to actually start the discussion. We will start with a presentation of the book by Peter, which is going to last about 10 minutes, and then we are going to have a conversation between the two great speakers.
Well, first of all, welcome everybody. And good to see lots of friends here this evening, going back, including my brother, and going back many, many years. And particularly, if you don't mind, single out a couple of people. Mike Brearley was the England cricket captain. And I think we should salute him, because he was the only England cricketer to back the anti-apartheid sports campaign at the time. And apart from Patricia, who's been a good friend, is now we're together in the House of Lords. We met when we were government ministers, weren't we, together? And Neil Kinnock, of course, was the Labour leader. Good to see you, Neil, here as well. And lots of friends from the anti-apartheid struggle as well. So, and there's a brilliant documentary being made by James Rogan, who's here somewhere. I don't know where he is. There he is in the back, on going out in Channel 4. In January, I think it is it? Or thereabouts, yeah. Anyway, look out for it, because it's an exceptional documentary, and got a lot of the people in the hall here this evening are in it. Look, I just wanted to remind you, and you mentioned this briefly, Roxana, and thank you to King's for hosting this. Thank you to Bobby Duffy, who heads the Policy Institute, for hosting it as well, and providing us with this venue and the drinks as well. 50 years ago, almost to the day, I was arrested for a bank theft I knew nothing about, honestly. An apartheid agent, looking rather like me, had robbed a branch of Barclays Bank in Putney, where I was living at the time, outside which we'd actually demonstrated, and Christabel, who was on the executive of the anti-apartheid movement at the time, will remember this, as will others, demonstrated because Barclays were involved in South Africa. And that very branch was robbed by a South African agent who looked remarkably like me, and I was arrested. Anyway, we landed up in the Old Bailey on a 2-week trial, and I was eventually acquitted, which was just as well, because I didn't know anything about it. And my fingerprint wasn't on the wad of banknotes. But that anti-apartheid struggle was a hard struggle. And people now take it for granted that Nelson Mandela walked to freedom from prison, 27 years in prison, and became president of the country. Take it for granted that apartheid was defeated, just like lots of other struggles are taken for granted. But we were in a minority at the time. Those of you who were involved will remember that. We were vilified. I was vilified as a high-profile member of it, but there were others who did far, far more work than I did, and some of them are here this evening. And we were all vilified, and we were in a minority. And yet, when we think of that struggle, and Neil was a big supporter of it, when you think of that struggle, we didn't do it to find it betrayed in government by people who were then corrupt and looted the country and stole billions from the taxpayers and cost the country about a fifth, South Africa that is, a fifth of its national wealth, a fifth. a terrible betrayal. Another one, those of you who are in university in the 1980s or 1970s may remember Daniel Ortega, the leader of the Sandinistas, as a pinner in student unions. Now he's a corrupt, misogynist, nepotistic dictator. How did this happen? This is the question that has haunted me, and I try to answer in the book. A lot of these countries, including South Africa, where I'm from originally, were products of European colonialism and often inherited corrupt structures. And I show in the book how that simply continued in the new government. And in South Africa's case, of course, apartheid was a deeply corrupt system. I get some white critics on social media attacking me and saying, well, apartheid may have been brutal, but it wasn't corrupt. Wrong. It was deeply corrupt. The defense industry particularly, but lots of other aspects of it as well. And colonialism was deeply corrupt too. When you look at Algeria, and Frantz Fanon wrote that magnificent book called The Wretched of the Earth in the 1950s, or you look at Angola, or you look at Gandhi's struggle for independence in India, a noble struggle which eventually won and defeated centuries of British rule. But the Congress Party that led that struggle became corrupt in government and was eventually kicked out of power and supplanted by a right-wing government, the BJP, who were bitterly anti-Muslim, and the Congress Party was a secular movement, and a very Hindu nationalist movement now rules India. So this is a big problem. In South Africa today, the majority of young people are so disenchanted with corrupt government that they actually favor military rule. If those of us in the anti-apartheid movement, we fought for democracy and the values of equal opportunities and human rights and social justice, and didn't do so to find that betrayed in government. But having said that, another social media myth: black Africans are no more corrupt than white Europeans or white Africans as either. This is not a race issue. This is a product of a world system. And that brings me on to the global dimension, which I was asked to expose in the House of Lords a while ago, and did, on information fed to me, and we probably cover this, by a deep throat inside the South African state, which was real gold dust stuff. And I exposed the global dimension, because if you look at apartheid, or you look at Nicaragua, or look at a lot of these other liberated independence countries, they're actually part of a global economic system. And what I found in the South Africa's case and exposed is a lot of the household names, the McKinseys, the KPMGs, the Bain & Companies, the banks, HSBC, Standard Chartered, Baroda Bank, were all deeply complicit in this looting and were involved in helping it to happen. In Bain & Company's case, they actually advised President Zuma, at his request, how to disable the South African Revenue Service, its tax collecting agency. They specifically advised that. So a once renowned tax collecting agency was reduced to a disabled shadow of its former self. So this is a global problem, and just one other fact to remember about all of this. You hear a lot in the British media and the Western and the global North media about overseas aid and development, how we're helping poor people in the rest of the world. Actually, more money is looted from Africa and is brought into countries like Britain and the overseas territories and elsewhere in the world, goes through Dubai, goes through Hong Kong, therefore China's culpable, than is actually given in overseas aid. So it's not a question of the rich global North supporting the global South. It's actually the other way around. The looted money by kleptocrats in those countries goes into our own countries. And the top criminals and money launderers seem to be able to get away with it. Have you ever tried opening a bank account? You have to prove your identity in triplicate, don't you? Or to move any money. These guys get away with moving billions around the world and laundering it and hiding it in often shell companies that conceal the fact that they are the real owners. And just get away with it, while the ordinary honest citizen seems to be absolutely clogged up in red tape And I can see a few nods lots of nods in the audience. You know what I mean? It's really frustrating. And these guys get away with it. So I don't think this is going to end, and I'll end on this point, until the governments of the world cooperate together. And I don't just mean the UK government and the US government. A bit difficult to imagine the US government cooperating on anything at the moment. As well as the European governments, it's got to be the Chinese government and the United Arab Emirates government as well, because Hong Kong and Dubai are the principal conduits for this money laundering on a ginormous scale. Unless that happens, we're not going to win this battle in the fight against corruption. It's a battle that's got to go on. And I conclude the book by saying this. We expected much more of liberation movements once they got into government. But actually, the moral of the story and the lesson is you've got to keep fighting for these values. They're never permanently won. You can see this in our own country at the moment, the rise of the populist right and various other things. Unless you keep fighting for social justice, equal opportunities, and human rights, you're never going to win those battles. You just got to keep fighting for them. Unless you do so in the fight against corruption, you will never win it. One small milestone along that road, which I discuss at the end of the book, is the establishment of an international anti-corruption court. The International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice do not cover corruption within their remits. You need a new court to prosecute and corral the kleptocrats who are running rife throughout the world at the moment. It won't, solve the problem on its own, but at least it'll be an important step, and I hope you'll all support it. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the book.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter, for this great introduction and for the great book, really. As an anti-corruption scholar, a lot of the chapters in your book hit almost too close to home. And let me start this conversation by asking both you and Patricia something that's been bugging me for the past 15 years. I'm Romanian born. And at the time when Romania was about to join the European Union, it was branded as the most corrupt country in Europe. Now there are other countries which are the most corrupt, somewhere in the Western Balkans. So the brand has shifted, let me put it like that. But we tend to think the corruption literature tends to position the global north as the provider of key values of democratization and the right way to institutionalize these values, whereas the global south, so to speak, is the provider of the practices of corruption. Is that true? How do you see this? This is a question for both of you, really.
I'll let Patricia start.
Well, I think it's basically a total myth, because if you look at the money that we have globally to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals in Paris and the amount of money that our governments have, the difference between those two figures is the sum equivalent to that which is siphoned off by corruption globally. That's number one. Number two, you'll notice that although the corrupt acts may happen or be perpetrated in the global south, the money doesn't stay in the global south. It is to be found in the global north. So it's circular. And therefore, I really agree with Peter that this is a global problem, not a south-north problem. And I remember one of the very first things I did when I became Secretary General, and a number of people have told me I am crazy. It's true. Because the first thing I did is I had a summit on corruption. And that summit was absolutely lightning, because we had a number of our leaders from across the Commonwealth came, not least President Buhari, and from Nigeria. And he was challenged about the level of corruption in Nigeria and what was said about Nigeria. And his response was this: I don't mind what they say about me. I just want my money back. And none of my money is Nigeria, it's here. And so getting the money back is all of our business, and it takes all of us. And unless you have a global approach, nothing will happen.
Absolutely. I can only fully agree with that. And maybe on this note, you talked about money movements from corrupt countries, or so we call them, to non-corrupt countries, or countries which are perceived as being non-corrupt. What's the role of intermediaries, of professional enablers in doing that? Peter has started to talk a little bit about that, but I was wondering if you can both talk about this a bit more and relate that to your own experiences and your own challenges from the jobs that you have done.
I mean, the professional enablers, who are they? Accountants, auditors, financial advisors, lawyers. These guys and girls are deeply complicit. Because if you look at the Gupta brothers who worked with former President Zuma to loot South Africa, they did so, and they set up shell companies and all sorts of other devices. They could not have done that without expert professional advice. Now, these professions are supposed to conform to international, their own ethics as professions and international standards. Do they help? They take the money, they enable laundered money to be, you and I try and buy a house. They want to know the source of the funds, don't they? If you want to rent a house, you've got to prove your identity. These guys get clever professionals, professional enablers, to do it for them. And you hinted at this, Patricia, and you might want to elaborate, but a lot of laundered money comes through London, comes through this city, around $90 billion a year, $90 billion a year. And then is, with the help of these professional advisors, sent into shell companies and hidden in the British Virgin Islands, in Gibraltar, in a number of the other overseas, UK overseas territories. We are deeply complicit in all of this. And I think that's what you were implying in the corruption in the Commonwealth context.
But I think one of the things that is really important is to understand there are those of us who have fought this our whole lives.
Yeah.
And so, for example, one of the things that we were responsible for in government, was the introduction of the Bribery Act. Now, the Bribery Act, for the first time, took universal jurisdiction. It went further than the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is American, because it meant that we could trace the money wherever it was, and we would be able to prosecute people who had removed money from country A and moved it to country B, and we could track and we could trace it. So I think that's why I say it has to be a global fight, and it has to be the fight for the good guys, actually, and girls against the bad ones. I remember saying to the 5 attorneys generals, we created something called the Quintet. Why did we do it? Because those who are corrupt are global and international, and they trespass against all our boundaries. And we have a conspiracy to fight, and I reckoned we had to have the conspiracy of the just, and that took all of us. So that's one. The second thing is that by working together, we can actually defeat this, and we are not powerless. We just can't do it on our own. Yeah. So I think joint action is absolutely fundamentally important, and we can do it.
By the way, if I'm allowed to, can I just welcome the South African High Commissioner? Give us a wave, Kinsley. Nice to see you. And sitting next to him are a couple of very brave guys, two of the London recruits, Stuart and Tom, who were smuggled into the country secretly and did all sorts of questionable things to defeat apartheid. So they sacrificed a great deal. Good to see you guys.
It's amazing the wealth of experience we have here in terms of both corruption and anti-corruption. So, but just to come back to your point, Patricia, about the need for partnerships to tackle corruption. I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more about what kinds of partnerships should be established at the regional or maybe at a global level in order to tackle corruption. This question comes from exactly from what you've said, but also from a sort of paradox.
Yeah.
We now have more anti-corruption tools that we've had ever in our lives, and yet we have the highest levels of corruption that we've ever seen. So I was wondering, why is that, and what are we missing here?
I think it's not just having the rules, it's actually having the implementation. Because we give people the structures and we give them the tools, and then they say, but how do I use them? How do I implement them? Because you have to have institutional tools to be able to do that. So one of the ways that we did it in the Commonwealth, and you'll know the Commonwealth now has 56 countries, and those countries are really responsible for looking after about 2.7 billion people in 5 different regions. And what we knew was it would be better together. So we created the Commonwealth anti-corruption benchmarks. And these aren't just legislation. This is how do you do it? How do you make sure that it's not just countries, but it's businesses, individuals, institutions, and that you attack procurement? How do you make sure that people procure goods honestly and effectively and transparently? And our countries, all of them, agreed to adopt the implementation of the anti-corruption benchmarks. And we've been working, and I hope they're still working, really hard to produce practical instruments that our countries and individuals can use to really attack this and stop it. But we had to do it with all of us. So we had all 56 ministries of justice adopting this, and the Commonwealth, as a group of 56 countries, endorsed it at the CHOGM, which is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and it's making a difference.
This is a phenomenal exercise, absolutely phenomenal. And when do you think we're going to see the results?
Well, I think we're starting to see them now, but the other thing, it's not just corruption, you've got to look at how government works generally. And one of the other things we managed to do with the Ministries of Justice is to create, and I hope Kings will have a look at it, are generally accepted performance management principles. And we have generally accepted principles for accounting. Anywhere in the world, we adopt a similar accounting measure, but we have nothing of that nature, or had not anything of that nature, about good governance, because good governance is very much in the eye of beholder. I will say my government is fantastic. You will say it's dreadful. And someone else will say in between. But there's no independent judgment. So the 56 countries, we all got together to define what are the generally accepted principles, just like for accounting, for good governance. And in Samoa, in 2024, the 56 countries agreed on the generally accepted performance principles which are implementable. And we created a structure which enables us to deliver it. So now for the first time, there is a basis upon which we can make that judgment on good governance. And I was just trying before I left to get Antonio Guterres to accept that maybe we should have it for the world and not just for our 56.
That is amazing, and it would be one of the first initiatives that comes not from the global north, so to speak, in terms of good governance. It comes from the global south.
By the way, I should briefly add that, I mean, Patricia is a lawyer, and I was a bit critical of those professions, but they're also very good people in each of these professions that you need. I mean, I do a lot of work with financial crime lawyer, and in order to track down some of this stuff and get it repatriated, you need that expertise and the good people who are working in it to actually coordinate.
And I think the majority are good, but the crooks are better at being evil than we are. And we've got to change that.
It's a matter of innovation. But Peter, can I just ask you to maybe forecast? Do you think with these tools, with these anti-corruption tools, do you think social movements would still fail?
Well, look, I take the view that unless you have popular pressure, you don't get change. You know, you need people, hopefully like Patricia and I, used to be Neil and others in the system to try and encourage change. I mean, at the moment we're fighting a big battle in the House of Lords to try and preserve the Employment Rights Bill. But you've got to have pressure from outside. So that's why one of the conclusions I come to is you've got to keep fighting for these things. Now, I'm not of an age that I was when I was charged with the bank theft and ran on Twickenham and stuff like that. And you need people to do that kind of thing of that age to keep putting the pressure on.
So you both are talking about different kinds of pressure. You're talking about top-down pressure through political will and such benchmarks. You are talking about bottom-up pressure, like the popular one, but also outside pressure. These are all kinds of pressures, but ultimately it's the political will, politics being whatever people do, not only leadership. Can you talk about your experience as leaders and the challenges that you have encountered, some of which you actually described very well in the book, Peter, in tackling corruption, like the fights you had to fight with some of your own peers, which I'm sure were not comfortable at all?
Well, I mean, for me it started with being asked by people in the African National Congress, the principal movement for liberation in South Africa, to expose what was going on under their president. So this was a group of people who wanted Jacob Zuma deposed, which he eventually was. And they are the ones who got together with me and said, would you expose this in the British Parliament? And so that's how that happened. And if that hadn't happened, and I hadn't done that, particularly the global corporate complicity, there's no point in me just repeating what brave investigative journalists were unearthing in the country. It was a question of saying, nailing the HSBC's complicity, nailing Standard Chartered's complicity. All of these corporates have got headquarters here in London. Bain and Company, McKinsey, all of them as well. And saying, these guys and girls, these corporates were implicitly connected to all of this. It would not have happened. They would not have been able to launder their billions out of South Africa. This goes for many other countries, and sometimes back in again, undetected, to be spent there, but mostly to be hidden elsewhere in the world. And virtually every government is complicit. So exposing that is what opened my eyes to all of this, and then led me to write this book eventually, and to support movements, for example, establish an international anti-corruption court. It's not going to be, and you will know from your legal experience, it's not the complete answer. It's just another deterrent, because what it would mean is some of these looters would be prevented from traveling to a country which had signed up. So, for example, South Africa hosted the G20. I think it was last year, maybe, or maybe this year, I'm not sure. But this year, was it? Relatively recently. And President Putin was not allowed, couldn't travel to the country for that G20 summit, which he would have been entitled to and expected to, because he could have faced arrest. Probably not from the government, but from civil society groups who made it clear they would issue an arrest warrant, principally for what he was doing in Ukraine, but and also because it's a deeply corrupt regime. So, I mean, these are not answers, the full answer. I don't think probably your Commonwealth benchmarks are, but they're important steps.
I think what's really important is to have practical implementation. It's great having sound bites and aspirations, but if people can't touch it, feel it, taste it, if it's not going to make a difference, then there isn't so much value to it. So I think certainly I found that people are so keen to tell you you're a dreamer. And if I am a dreamer, I'm a very practical dreamer, because I want all my dreams to come true. And that means that you have to really make partners with anybody who is willing to work with you. You need partners in business, you need partners in charities, you need individuals, you need governments, you need local. You need to find international organizations who will help to mirror what you're doing. And is I found it fundamentally important for me to have others who are willing to work with me. And I've actually found it inspirational, because you will find there'll be accountants and lawyers and architects and all these different professions who are fed up as well, and they're willing to come and work. And so I'm really clear that it's not about optimism or pessimism, it's about determination. You have to be absolutely determined that they're not going to win, and we are.
I really like the definition of leadership as a practical dreamer. It's really nice, especially when it comes to corruption and anti-corruption. I mean, I have a bunch of other questions, but I'm actually thinking that because we have such a wealth of experience in the room, maybe we should open up the Q&A session so that we get more questions from the audience. I see the first hand there, and there. So the gentleman. Can I please ask you to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. The name's Ewan Grant, UK Defence Forum. I was the old Customs and Excise intelligence analyst for transnational crime in the ex-Soviet Union. We were actually in such a bad way with corruption ourselves that they had to parachute in a team from MI5 and MI6 to sort it out. That was in Lord Hain's time, so thank you very, very much indeed. I have subsequently been the subject of threats from journalists in Britain working on behalf of Russia. My question is for you both, and indeed for the chairman, how do you see the professional bodies in the UK and particularly in the Commonwealth, and therefore links with hopefully professional bodies in the United States, because Trump won't last forever, about sanctioning internally so that even if enablers cannot be prosecuted, because they can leg it, as you said, to Dubai, that something can be done to start squeezing it, or at least greatly improving the quality of evidence that can be put in front of the court of public opinion. It's a bit like attributing cyber attacks. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Well, I could give you a practical example. I named an international law firm based here in London, but also across the world, which was complicit in part of the looting episode, or the looting decade under former President Zuma. And I spoke about it in the Lords. I then referred them to the Solicitors Regulation Authority, which, as you will know, is supposed to regulate solicitors, lawyers in the country who practice as solicitors. And the law firm said it was a global firm for branding purposes only. Branding purposes only. In fact, it was a global legal firm in every respect, with offices right across the world. So the SRA, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, having accepted there was a locus, because it had an office in London, a big office in London, then accepted this explanation that it was for branding purposes only, and then, dropped the case. I then had another experience with Standard Chartered Bank, where I named them when I gave evidence, drafted actually by a financial crime lawyer for me. I couldn't have done it on my own, for the Zondo Judicial Commission in South Africa. And I named a number of these banks, which they were naming as well as a judicial commission, Standard Chartered. And one of the processes here, you do written evidence, and then it's shown to the people you name, and they are invited to respond. Most of them, very wisely, didn't respond. But Standard Chartered did. And it said, it's very unfair of you to criticize our bank because the money left our Johannesburg branch, and they admitted this, went to Dubai, and Dubai is a completely different jurisdiction, and what happens in Dubai has nothing to do with us. So this is a bank with global branches everywhere in the world, Standard Chartered, British Bank, and it went through their digital pipelines from Johannesburg into Dubai. That wasn't disputed, but the Johannesburg branch said I was wrong to criticize them because they had nothing to do with the Dubai office and what happened there, which my answer was, when in holes, stop digging. But they got away with it.
No, and I think one of the good things is when you have robust regulatory bodies who actually enforce the rules. And certainly, I know the Bar Council is really robust. I don't know Peter's experience on that occasion, but strengthening the professional bodies is incredibly important. The other thing that I would say is this. I found as a prosecutor, as Attorney General, that we had to look at the challenges there were in prosecuting people under the criminal jurisdiction and then look at the benefits of pursuing them through the civil jurisdiction. Because what we realise, the two things that those who are corrupt and want to benefit from the assets want is as follows. One, they calculate how likely is it that I'm going to be caught. And the second, if caught, how likely is it that I will retain the benefits of my corrupt practice? And so you have to heighten the likelihood that they'll be caught, so they'll think more likely than not, because it's like paying tax. The tax is I'll get caught. The second tax is I will be relieved of the burden of my ill-gotten gains. And what we found is if we can track and trace their assets and remove all their assets from them and increase the likelihood they'll be caught, it means that corruption isn't worth it. And I can't tell you how delightful it is when you relieve someone of the burden of their assets. And what we did is and people said that I couldn't do this, okay? This was new modern law and it was terrible. I reversed the burden of proof. Because if you have millions in your bank account and tragically you don't know how it got there. You woke up in the morning and there it was, 500 million. Oh my dear. So we said, since we couldn't say where you got it from, we'd help you out. We'd say, you give us an explanation. And if you can explain to us on the balance of probabilities where you got it from, you can keep it. But if you can't explain where you got it from, well, you poor thing, I need to help you out and remove it from you. And that has done more to stop people, because the purpose of doing this is to get the benefit. And if you're not going to get the benefit, if they're going to take your boats and your houses and your cash and your jewellery, then maybe it's not worth it. And I'm really good at relieving people of burdens.
Sounds frightening.
Absolutely. If I may add one thing to this, I absolutely think it's the money that
follow
hits
the money.
Too close home. But Peter's book is probably one of the rare instances, and obviously the most recent, but really rare instances in which there is an acknowledgement that there is some sort of corruption in the UK and in the global north. A few years ago, I work on corruption. I've been working on corruption and anti-corruption for 15 years now. A few years ago, we had a project, a massive European project, and we looked at the representation of corruption across Europe. And what we discovered was that in the UK, the word corruption was never used in relationship to internal affairs. It was always something that happened out there, never at home. So whatever scandals we had in the UK, like the expenses scandal, for example, it was never branded as corruption. And I kept wondering why. Is it a matter of understanding in terms of journalistic
You're
terms?
talking about the parliamentary expenses.
Yes,
yeah.
the parliamentary expenses. So the fact that you are talking about corruption here in our very own environment, and you're talking about following the money here at home, I think is absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, one of the sections of the book is actually looks at the COVID experience here. and remember the rip-offs, including by a notable member of the Lords, who seems to have lost a lot of money and is complaining about us. It's, you know, you feel sorry for her, don't you?
Very.
But is that corruption is everywhere. And that's one of the things I show. I describe how the colonial powers created, they plundered, they literally stole resources off the indigenous people in the global south, and then created a corrupt system which was inherited. And that was true in South Africa, as I mentioned, under apartheid. You know, there's all sorts of evidence supplied for that. I mean, one of the I hope benefits of this book is everything is footnoted, because Ginny, the commissioning editor, made sure that otherwise the lawyers wouldn't have allowed it through. And don't know where you are, Jack, but Jack Cinnamons, who's up over there hiding behind the column, is credited on the title page for the research that he did, and he just dug out these online sources in an amazing fashion. So everything is sourced.
As it should be in this case. Shall we take a few more questions? We had one there, and then the gentleman here. Over there, and then the gentleman there.
Good evening, Charles Perry. Thank you so much. Really fascinating conversation. Easy question. Turning to the Middle East, on the subject of struggles for freedom and liberation, I'd love to know, Peter, you and Patricia, I mean, given the very topical current situation, the quest by the Palestinian people for liberation. Can you comment on that, given all of your experience in South Africa, Ireland, and other divided nations and societies, and on the, if you might want to throw in something about your friend Tony Blair's role in it as well?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is a big question you've asked, Charles, and it would take a long time, which we don't have, for me to answer it. But in brief, I've always believed in an independent Palestinian, democratically run Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel. Whether that's achievable now, given what's happened with the illegal settlement in the West Bank and the demolition of Gaza, is an altogether different question. One of the things that worries me about the current situation is the corruption in the West Bank government, the corruption of the Israeli Prime Minister, who's on corruption charges. Yeah. And then if you look at Hamas, they're executing people that are not part of their militia, dissidents to them. This is not a promising basis for a democratic Palestinian state. So I could say lots of other things about what's gone on in the whole situation, the horror in Gaza, but I think those are the things I wanted to stress. The corruption that is a problem about the transition to, if it's possible still, to a two-state solution, and I'm not sure that it is, and indeed the Israeli government opposes it, but also the problem of actually dealing with corruption is very live in the situation. And by the way, having negotiated the 2007 Northern Ireland settlement under Tony Blair that brought together, and Jonathan Phillips was the political director sitting in the back there, and the permanent secretary in the Northern Ireland office. We had an amazing team that brought together Ian Paisley Sr., who'd always said no surrender, together with Martin McGuinness, the ex-IRA commander, to share power amicably together. None of the lessons of that Northern Ireland peace settlement, beginning with the Good Friday Agreement and then what we achieved 10 years later, and completed it in a way, have been applied in the Middle East. Almost none of them. If you did, for example, just to touch on one, the British government for years, British governments of all kinds, refused to deal with the IRA because the IRA were terrorists, including bombing British cities and lobbing a mortar into Downing Street with the intention of killing people in there. Refused to deal with it. In the end, they realized they couldn't defeat the IRA, and the IRA realized they couldn't kick the British out of Northern Ireland, and so that opened up the space for negotiation. Whatever Netanyahu says, the Israeli Prime Minister, he's not going to defeat Hamas militarily. It's an ideological force, like the IRA was. And Tony Blair's Chief of Staff, Jonathan Powell, wrote a very good book called Talking to Terrorists, saying that all conflicts have to end with a negotiated solution. And what we've had and what has been going on in recent weeks is not a proper negotiated solution. So I'll just leave it at that.
I think it's really important to understand how you build peace. I've had a real privilege of working with a number of countries across the Commonwealth who have been in positions of real vulnerability, real fragility. About 26, 27 of the 56 countries during my 9 years needed help. And what Peter says is right. In order to bring people together, you cannot just concentrate on what divides them. I think you have to identify it very clearly, what divides them, but then you've got to do something else. You've got to work on what joins them. And what I found is if you enable people to put aside just for a little while some of the most intractable, difficult, painful things and flip it and get them to focus on, so what do we want? What can we jointly agree on? What I have found is that usually, and it's long and it's painful, and did it for Northern Ireland, you get to the stage where actually they do and are able to agree on 90%. The last 10% is awful and terrible, but when you turn, having agreed the 90%, you can then look at the painful 10%, and what I've found is you can usually get them to agree 5% of that 10%, and the 5% that they can't agree on, you can persuade them to disagree well. And that's how you get a solution. And it's not easy because it demands that you do something that many of us don't like doing, and that's listening. It's probably worth saying it's nearly at an end. And then hear what they're saying. And there's no situation that I've come across when there has not been pain and grief on both sides. And that's a reality as to how you negotiate peace. So I think it's going to be incredibly difficult what's happening now in the Middle East, but I do think there's an opportunity for us to distill from all the negotiations we've had what works. And if you look at what works, whether it was in South Africa or elsewhere, they tend to be similar things that you have to do in order to bridge that gap. And we have to be ready and willing to do it.
Thank you. We're nearly at the end now, so we're going to take 3 more questions. I'll have the gentleman there.
So my name is Lindsay Thomas, and I would say in passing that I was the director of the Financial Services Authority, responsible for financial crime. So I have some background in this. But what I would say is this, is that people who are corrupt think they deserve it. That's one of the problems. And the reason they think they deserve it is because they think power talks. And I have to say, looking at the President of the United States, he thinks power talks, that power can override the courts or Congress or whatever you like. That's what happens in these countries. And I ask whether you see a link between creating liberation movements and the corruption that follows. Because liberation movements are about seizing power, right? And they have seized power, and then not long after that, they think, I've got all this power, I deserve it, I created it, right? It's kind of mine. And in that, I deserve this money. And the same thing happens in financial services. The people there think they're that clever, they're in the right place, they're prepared to do those things, they deserve to get the money. And of course, in lots of other things without corruption, that's exactly what financial services pay their people millions of pounds a year to be successful, to use that power successfully for the company. So do you see that part of it is the way that liberation movements are constructed actually leads to it being more likely that the people at the top will go off course and take up corruption?
Lindsay, thanks for that. I just have 2 observations. One, there's a chapter in the book about the fusion of party and state. If you have a liberation movement that says you're the sole repository of the people's will, and that's been true for pretty well all of them. It was true of the Bolsheviks in Russia and elsewhere. Then you tend to find deeply corrupt consequences, because people who get into power enjoy being in power, think they speak for the people, and they're going to stay there. That's what's happening, you know, in Nicaragua, so tragically at the moment, for example. The other, you're saying you used to work for the Financial Services Authority, and in that key role. One of the things governments across the world, including our own haven't done, is resource their enforcement agencies properly. The FSA, the Serious Fraud Office, the National Crime Agency. I think it was the National Crime Agency that asked the last Conservative government for an extra 2.7 billion. Refused. And you look right across the world, and especially probably in the global south that you would have seen a lot of in the Commonwealth, the resourcing of the investigative and enforcement agencies is so low. One of the benefits of the American system that I see President Trump has suspended was that you had a proportion of the looted funds that you recovered came back to you as an enforcement agency. That gave you an independence from the state and from politicians. It's a lesson there.
Well, I think there are a number of things that we have learnt in order to strengthen the systems. But I actually think that if you look at most of the liberation movements, they were concentrating on relieving their people of the hardships that they suffered, but they weren't concentrating on how you rebuild institutions. And many of those governments, many of those countries had very poor, weak infrastructure, didn't have the wherewithal to deliver, when the new government came in, the sort of tools and structures that they needed. So I think one of the things absolutely critical for us is we have to build resilience, we have to build institutions, and we have to build systems. Without those systems, things don't work. I mean, I spent at least the last 9 years looking at what effective governance means. And what we've discovered is this: 80% of good governance is having a good system. 20% is the people. So even if you have brilliant people and you have a terrible system, the likelihood is that you will only be able to deliver about 60% of what you want. But if you have a good system, which is able to deliver 80% of the good governance, and 20% is people, what we then found is that a good leader is 80% of the people. So if you have a good system and a good leader, the likelihood is that you will have good governance. And we have distilled how you can do that in a way that we think will materially improve the delivery. So if you have the liberation, but you don't have the transformation of the institutions and the systems, you are unlikely to achieve that which you aspire to. And I think it is now doable. And particularly with blockchain and all these new methods we can make corruption much more difficult. I don't say impossible, but now you can track and trace, because everything that you do can have an identifier, so you can make it very difficult to get away with corruption without getting the benefit of having your collar felt and been relieved of the burden of your ill-gotten goods.
I just add, if I may, to Patricia's point. When HSBC I named them in the House of Lords as one of the principal digital conduits for the looted money to get out of the country and be hidden. They wanted to see me. So their bosses came to see me. So I said, you know what's happened to that money, because it's all, to reinforce your point, it's digitized. You can do the digital trail. Oh, they said, client confidentiality. You know, client confidentiality, in my view, applies to people like us, who are honest citizens, and all the millions out there are. Not to these guys. who use these banks. And there's one other observation, Patricia, particularly following what Patricia said. South Africa has probably the best constitution in the world.
Fantastic.
Drawn up by Oliver Tambo initially in opposition during the resistance and initiated by him. It had a very good revenue service. It had a very good prosecuting agency. So the institutions are right, but what happened is the top put people into those institutions to disable them and wreck them. So you need both, as you said. You need the leaders and you need the institutions. But don't think that the one is possible, it's possible to achieve what you want, unless you have both.
Absolutely. This is a fantastic observation to finish on. I know I promised 3 questions. I'm really sorry I can't keep up my promise because we are at the end of the event. But what I would encourage you is to, so Peter is going to sign books. We are selling books over there. Peter's book is there and we strongly encourage you to buy the book. It's fantastic. I've read it twice, I have to say, because I was preparing for tonight.
What a sad woman.
Thank you. So we strongly encourage you to buy the books and grab Peter and Patricia, maybe for a couple of minutes if you have burning questions. So I'm going to wrap up here with your permission, but please join me in thanking Peter and Patricia for tonight's contribution, which was absolutely fantastic.
That was great. Wonderful. Thank you.
Very much. I'm sorry. I would have taken more questions, but I wasn't sure about your
Yeah.